Welcome everybody, Christina Wolf here, and this is another episode of Discovering the Empowered Self, a healing journey from early childhood trauma. And today we have with us Roshni Patel. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Roshni Patel. I am a worthiness coach. So I essentially focus on building and cultivating other people's self-worth and their idea of self-love, because I truly don't think that there's, one singular path for all of us. But I think that if you believe in yourself and you feel that you are worthy of your own dreams, that you can make your life, your dream life, essentially. So the tools that I use are NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, and then I use EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, and then I also use some bits and pieces from art therapy, especially because a lot of us don't tend to use art in day-to-day life, but we're all creative people, so connecting with that side of you, I think is really important.
Awesome. I can totally relate to the worthiness piece. Can you talk a little bit about how your own early childhood trauma story led you to this becoming a worthiness coach?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was actually born in Nairobi, Kenya, and then I moved to the US when I was just before I turned 5. So, my whole extended family was in Kenya, my whole life was there, and then just kind of suddenly overnight we'd gotten uprooted and we're in a different place. And so kind of coming from a developing country and a place where, everyone around me was like brown or African, and coming to the US and especially moving to Texas, like a suburb outside of Dallas, it was a huge culture shock. And so that kind of beginning of what I was starting to get accustomed to and who I thought I was, all kind of got disrupted. So that was a huge part of just kind of cultural trauma and all of that. But then the added layer was, just my difficult relationship with my parents. And I think there had been, a long line of people in our family just not, I don't know, I guess just there was a lot of generational things that happened that kind of led to me having this experience with my parents. And I think it's not really like completely their fault, but they had been, raised a certain way and treated a certain way, and that's kind of what they knew. So, we're still working on a relationship and all of that, but just kind of the lack of communication between us was pretty big. It was constantly like, you need to be this person, and it wasn't about figuring out who I am. And so that led to me, constantly wanting to be someone else or wanting to be something else. And so when I got to college, I didn't believe all my interests and all my talents were in writing and literature and history and, psychology. Those were the things that I really loved. But I was like, well, it's not worth it to do those things because those things aren't valued. So I need to force myself to be like a neuroscientist and study dementia and Alzheimer's because that's impressive and that's what people look for. And so, it was kind of like this whole chain of events leading up to me constantly, putting myself down or assuming that what I naturally was inclined towards wasn't worthy enough. And so slowly over the last few years, especially in college, I started getting really bad panic attacks. I had worsening anxiety and depression. And from that, I kind of realized that it's because I wasn't serving myself. And I started studying psychoanalysis, and I looked at, what the self is versus the ego. And I realized my entire existence had been serving this ego. And so, that really called me to pull back the layers and start looking at who my real self is. And so now I'm really passionate about having other people discover their true self and really live that part of their lives out. So yeah, that's a little bit about my journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. What I wanted to kind of expand upon, before we did this recording, we chatted a little bit, and you were talking about how your upbringing or, your childhood trauma led to like your formative belief system, mm-hmm. and how we can have things that aren't necessarily physical abuse, but like emotional neglect and, like a lot of pressure to deny who you are to conform another idea. And what you're referring to is like kind of generational trauma. Like many of the women in my family, we had this mentality of we have to handle everything because the men in our lives don't show up, you know, and that became a generational thing all the way back to my grandmother. And it was like, this formed my belief. This formed how my grandparents treated my father before he left our family. And so that's one of the reasons for this interview series, is to heal generational trauma. Because when we get to our generation, if we don't heal it, then we're perpetuating it. We're going to continue that same thing with our kids and move it, you know, and some of it, a lot of it is unconscious. Like, can you go into how you decided that you needed to address your worthiness? Like, at what point did you realize? Was it when you were having your panic attacks that you said, something's got to change?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's definitely kind of where it started. And I was like, something has to change. But it wasn't until after I graduated college and I got my first, you know, well-paying full-time job that I really started to reflect back on all these lessons from my childhood. And I even started doing like really going back and thinking about things. And I would even find things that I watched when I was younger, or, you know, pop culture and media that was famous back then that I grew up on. And I would say, like, I would rewatch it and be like, what lessons did this teach me? And slowly over the course of that year, you know, thinking back on my family, what I was taught, even opening up some of these conversations with my parents, I realized that I had more unlearning to do than learning to do. And that's when I was like, okay, this is about shedding these layers. This is about not covering up who I am anymore. And then, you know, slowly I've kind of started this journey of, you know, being okay with taking up space. And a lot of what has taught me that has actually been entrepreneurship and starting up my YouTube channel and different things like that. Because, you know, in my mind, for so many years, I was just in this completely exclusionary standpoint, because I had grown up, you know, in upper middle class suburbs, and then I came to this school where the majority of the students were in the top 1%. And so, you know, I was constantly at the bottom of that. So I would say, you know, when teachers or when professors are giving blanket advice, they're talking to these rich people who come from a different background. They're not talking to me. So over, you know, years, I basically started to exclude myself from these spaces and from this advice. And I'd be like, oh, there's another Indian person doing that one thing, so that means I can't do it. Or, you know, like these weird things where I was just like,
put yourself in the other category.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And so, you know, all of those things together made me realize that I knew that I was really envious of, you know, people who were really open in front of the camera, or people who were vulnerable, people who wanted to share what they wanted. And I realized that it wasn't that I was envious or jealous. It was just that that's what I wanted for myself. And so realizing that that kind of envy, or that comparison envy, was just teaching me a lesson about what I truly wanted. And then from there, just going for it. And with every new video and every new blog and all these different things that I put up, you know, it's slowly just making more and more space. And so I realized that no one's going to come up to me and hand me like this platform. You know, I have to grow it, and I have to claim that space for myself before anyone else can, you know, give me that.
Like what you're describing kind of reminds me a lot of me. It's when we have parents who are, for lack of a better term, like codependent, like they're living through us, they're expecting to get their emotional needs met through us. We, as like the good child trying to keep the parent happy, never really form our own identity. And then when we do have preferences, we're really unsure of it. We're like, I don't know. It's hard to own them and give yourself permission to want them. And it's a subtle thing. It's not like you're doing it consciously. You're just always learned that in order for me to survive, in order for me to be happy, in order for me to maintain my own safety, I have to keep the person who's my primary caretaker happy. And yet that's not a healthy, in psychological terms, it's called enmeshment or codependency. And if you do have parents who really enmesh you, it can teach you that interpersonal relationships are exhausting, and that you tend to not self-actualize. You tend to not do the thing that you really want. You hide it. You keep it to yourself.
Exactly. and you're
Yeah,
just playing a supporting role for anyone else that you're around, you know. And I
exactly.
didn't realize, yeah, but at such a young age, I just was kind of a people pleaser because I didn't know what else to do. You know, my safety depended on me pleasing another person. So when that's the case, you can't just easily break out of that. And then I started
That was the
realizing,
pattern that taught you this works for me, this keeps me safe.
exactly, exactly. And when I, you know, was a teenager and I was growing up, and, you know, I'm, you know, in every high school experience, there's, you know, drama with friends or whatever. And it wasn't even like a lot of personal drama. It was just, you know, I was constantly around people feeling things, and teenagehood is just, you know, an emotional time. So I, you know, was starting to be more emotional and feel more things. I realized that I didn't trust my own emotions. Like, I didn't know what my emotions meant. I didn't know how I should feel about a lot of things. I would constantly ask my friends, like, should I be mad about this? Like, I don't even know, because I, you know, when you're a kid and you're crying because you're upset and you're a toddler and someone's telling you, like, just don't cry, like, just don't, you know, like, you're being annoying. It's like you're constantly taught from such a young age to not express your emotions, to not believe yourself. And that's
To
why
deny the self.
exactly. And that's why
Deny yourself to make me happy,
me
basically.
have, yeah, it's just, it's all about serving this other person's ego. And then, yeah, so that's why the first online course that I made was about trusting yourself, because I had no idea what self-trust was. And I just didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted. And all of these things were so buried. And so I was like, this is the kind of course that I would want to take, because it genuinely helps me realize that I'm valid. Whatever I say or want is true. And I do have ways to figure out what I really want, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the important piece that I want to convey is just how subtle this can be. Because
Mhm.
when you're a child, you really think that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing by making your parent happy, or, you know, people pleasing. And at the same time, you may not realize that you're truly denying what you want. It's so buried and it's so subtle and it's subconscious. And so I'm curious, when you finally realize, okay, I'm doing this thing and it's not making me happy anymore, but I keep doing it, you get that, another psychological term, cognitive dissonance, where you're just like, I know I'm doing this thing and it's not helping me, and it's because of the way I was raised. And the other piece too I wanted to add was what you're talking about, not trusting yourself, not really forming the self. That's a huge indication of like trauma from attachment issues as a child. If you do have
Mhm.
not just abandonment, but when we fear what's called engulfment, like our parents enmeshing us so much, that's
Mhm.
where we also give up the self. We give more authority to the other. We say, well, your
Right.
opinion and your thoughts matter more because I'm not real sure about what I think and feel. And
Exactly.
it's really, it leaves you vulnerable to people to take advantage of you, for, or, you know, some disreputable characters to then become part of your life, because your boundaries are, I thought that that wasn't a good idea, but I let that person get close. And
Yeah,
that's
it's
where some of that perpetuation comes in. Yeah.
mhm.
So when you're using NLP, can you explain for like our listeners who's never heard of what NLP is? Can you tell us a little bit about what that acronym means and how it works?
Definitely. So NLP is stands for Neuro Linguistic Programming, and it basically addresses your linguistic patterns and your behavioral patterns. So basically, the premise of it is that once there's a variety of different tools and techniques, including swishing and anchoring. Those are all parts of NLP. So all of these tools can really help you change your own behavior, and it works in a really rapid way. And I think that, you know, I spent a good number of years in therapy, and some of it helped, but a lot of it just, it was so much rooted in going back to the past that, you know, there were memories that I didn't necessarily want to visit, but I also wasn't being told like what revisiting that would do for me. And we weren't pulling out very many patterns other than to just say, you know, a lot of emotional abuse occurred, there was trauma, those kinds of things. So I felt like I was constantly being pulled back to just revisit these things that weren't helping me, and I wasn't getting a way to move forward. So these NLP techniques actually allow you to, there's a couple of different ways that you can use NLP, but in a lot of situations, you can start with a singular event that happened to you in your past, or you can start with something that you're dealing with now. So say, setting boundaries is an issue and you want to start to program yourself to feel more comfortable setting straight boundaries. Or there's so many different ways that you can use NLP. So you can use it in the present moment, and that will kind of unveil some of your limiting beliefs. And a lot of things in NLP, along with, repeating affirmations, those together really work to reorient your limiting beliefs. So there's actually something called psychological reversal. And that's basically when, even if consciously, you're like, of course I want to make money. Of course I want to be stable. Of course I want to be happy. But deep down, there's something in your subconscious that's keeping you from that. And it's actually pulling you towards being miserable, just being unhappy and not being satisfied.
Self-sabotaging.
Yeah, exactly. So, self-sabotaging is psychological reversal, and that reversal can be changed and aligned with using things like NLP, because you're going to that core of saying, I'm secretly sabotaging myself so that I stay miserable. And then you can say things like you want to be happy. And then that also leads me to EFT. You can tap on these things too. You can tap on affirmations, or you can tap on negative memories from your past, or you can tap on current fears. So there's so many different places to start. And I think that's what really makes it accessible for people with childhood trauma, because I think choice is really, really important here. Not everyone wants to start from really difficult memories in their childhood, but using something in the present can help you still kind of get to the bottom of what that bad memory when you were younger ended up instilling in you and in your identity.
Yeah, I love all of that. That's one thing about NLP. It kind of reminds me of EMDR. Is it eye movement, rapid desensitization? It's that when we go into like therapy and they want us to do, if you're not with a therapist or practitioner who's really trained in trauma recovery, they'll want to talk a lot. And talk therapy has been proven not to be as effective as some of these other neuroscientifically based practices, because trauma ultimately, things like PTSD and complex PTSD are they're a dysfunction with memories. We have these memories that get trapped and we're reliving them. They're staying in the present. And so sometimes when you get triggered by like really simple things, and we can talk about that when we get into swishing, or, but I wanted to mention, you talked about anchoring, and I feel like that's a lot of what I do when I'm teaching, self-supporting habits like meditation, shamanic journeying, all these are all things that support the self as you dig into your grief and your trauma. Because at one point, I think before our recording, we talked about how therapy can kind of almost re-traumatize you, because you're talking about all these memories, you're bringing them up, you're reliving them in the body, you're feeling the pain in the body, and then time's up, you got to go now, and you still have that grief in your body, and that's the part that's keeping you in that moment.
Right.
And that's how I think this NLP and the EMDR and all those other neuro scientific practices or processes interrupt that trauma trigger.
Exactly. And there's even a practice in NLP where you take like the tip of a pen or, a pencil, and you just follow it with your eyes and you make a figure 8. And as you're following with your eyes, there could be a point where it stops being a fluid motion and it kind of glitches with your eyes, with the pen. And that's when you're tapping into a memory or something in that part of your brain, because, as you switch from one side to the other, you're switching between the sides of your brain. So you can point to a place where trauma is stored. And so, yeah, the eye movements and all of that are really, really important in getting yourself to even realize that something is stuck there. Because especially like we were just talking about, the amount of self-doubt that you have, you're like, I don't know if I'm normal, I don't know if everyone deals with this, or, you know, you're constantly trying to figure out where you stand. And so being able to,
or you think because I go through all this, I'm weird, like nobody else is stressing out like I am, like you have this big old story in your head. Yeah.
Where you just isolate yourself. And so there's a couple of different sides, but because, you know, you don't have to be face to face with a therapist, which is also can play on as like an authoritative figure that kind of reminds you of that, you know, power dynamic relationship with a parent or a family member. And so it doesn't put you on the spot as much when you're, you know, just at home practicing something, or you're using a video, or, you know, like even if it's a Skype session with, you know, myself or a life coach, you're not under that really intense amount of pressure. And, you know, I always keep buffer time outside. So it, you know, if something goes a little longer, it's fine, because it's an overall 3-month package. So it's not like, you know, oh, it's 450, you're kicked out now, because I've had that same experience where, you know, you're left out, you don't have another appointment for 3 or 4 weeks, and, you know, you're just kind of in this space of grieving. And yeah, you can get re-traumatized, which is really why I wanted to bring up the window of tolerance as well, because revisiting a lot of those memories can, you know, re-traumatize you, or at least make you face this grief. And I do think that grief in some extent is kind of a part of healing, but it's hard to feel like someone is with you in this, and then the second your hour's up, you're all alone again. And then you kind of, if you have abandonment issues, that can really trigger a lot for you, especially. So
it's really important. Like if you're going to open up Pandora's box, give people skills to close it.
Exactly.
So that they can heal themselves. They don't have that sense of, okay, now what? Like, I feel awful still.
Right.
How can I move this energy out of me? So can you expand on, and that sort of leads up to, we talked about people's window of tolerance, like where everybody gets to a point where we're like, okay, I can't deal anymore, and I can't get past this. Basically, if you open up Pandora's box and you start going into painful memories, and some people literally have walled it off, because your body is actually, your mind is trying to protect you when you numb or suppress memories or feelings or emotions. And it's that numbness people are afraid to let go of, because it's protected them. Like, why would I want to feel pain if I know I don't know if it's ever going to stop? You know, this worry of a never-ending pain or how to make it go away. The only way I've been able to make it go away was to ignore it or suppress it. So can you explain a little bit more about that window of tolerance, and like how you help people move past that, or when they work with you?
Yeah, definitely. So the window of tolerance is really just about your own level of comfort with certain memories. So a lot of the time too, a lot of the memories that we're truly uncomfortable with have already been repressed. But, you know, if there is a major trauma, something that you can't repress or forget, you can still get the same amount of benefits from EFT or from NLP without having to revisit that memory. And that's what I love so much. Like if you are, for example, you know that you push people away, you know that either you have a trouble with boundaries, or that you constantly stir up some sort of drama so that they feel like they have to leave you, and then you're like, everyone leaves me, you know, you're living out that story. So if that's the case, and you know that it happened because of, you know, this painful series of events with your father having, you know, going through all this stuff. So you don't have to go back to your father and immediately, you know, tap on that or revisit those memories, but you can say, I push people away, and that can kind of be what you tap on. So as you're tapping,
because you have a lot of meaning making too about what you're doing to serve yourself subconsciously, you know, because you are trying to protect yourself. I'm pushing people away because I don't want to feel the pain of abandonment, but now I feel guilty because there's something wrong with me because I push people away.
Right. And so it's okay if you don't want to go visit those core wounds immediately, and you should you know, it's a complicated story that you're dealing with. So you should, you know, honor it and treat it with respect, and not, you know, use your own past against yourself. But what you can do is you can say, okay, I know I have a problem with, you know, making people abandon me, basically, and I know that's a story I want to deal with. So what EFT is it basically focuses on the meridian points, like in this area. So it uses the same basic science as acupuncture or something else like that. So it combines acupuncture and meridian points that are used in Eastern technology, as well as mind-body medicine. So the combination of them and talking through things can actually release things that are stored in your energy points. And another point is that it's actually based off of the lymphatic system. So in this area right here, if you go to the U notch under your throat and you go down 3 inches, and then either to the left or the right 3 inches, you have 2, there's kind of a tender spot. So if you just rub it, this is actually a lymphatic point, and the lymph stores a lot of bacteria and viruses and cancer cells, and it kind of goes through the tissues and the arteries of the body to clean out these negative things. And then it goes through the lymphatic system to, again, get rid of those sources. So if there are, you know, emotions do manifest in your physical body. So that's why we tap on these points and use these areas of like related to the lymphatic system, so that you can really disperse that lymph, which is actual fluid, and kind of release that energy from your body. So it's nice because I've actually, you know, I've been like, oh, this feels so good to just like rub this point. And especially when I'm doing EFT, you know, I just kind of massage it for a little bit, and it does almost feel euphoric in a way. And I think it's because you're really, like, you can feel the release coming off of you, which is great. But back to my original point. So with tapping, you can tap on why, you know, you have a difficulty with relationships now. And maybe that'll lead you to saying, you know, I wanted to be loved. I wanted to be loved, and these people left me, and I just want to protect myself. I don't want to deal with that pain again. That's all you need to know to begin this healing journey. And then from there, you can say, I want to be loved. I want to be accepted. I belong. And these can inform the affirmations that you start with. So then every day you can start saying these affirmations that are like directly, consciously and actively addressing your hidden subconscious limiting beliefs, and using that pattern, creating a routine around self-care and self-love. And these affirmations can really allow you to start being a little bit more compassionate to yourself. That compassion can lead to a little bit of grieving, and then that grieving can lead to finally just releasing, you know. And the great thing about EFT is that you can continue it over and over and over again, and the way it actually starts and ends is by you rating the intensity of that emotion. So I've tapped on things where the emotional intensity is at like a 9 or 10 out of 10. And by the time I'm done with just a few rounds of EFT, it's already at a 6 or a 7. And so you can literally measure, you know, how low it's going. And just this one singular event can lead you to uncover so many of your limiting beliefs that you may not have even known you had.
Yeah, I like how just you don't even really need to know why it's working for you. You just know it's working to basically calm down your parasympathetic nervous system and, you know, the lymph system. And because you have these, if you're in the habit of having these traumatic thoughts, you know, you've built up so many neural pathways, you immediately arrive at these thoughts constantly, and they're stress inducing. They create that stress in the body, the chemical cocktail in your body that then gets stored in your lymphs. And, you know, and ironically, this is perfect. Like right here, this is also a lung point, right? And grief is stored in your lungs. That's one of the areas of your body. People who have like emphysema, COPD, if you have stored grief you haven't been able to let go of, it's in the heart chakra, it's in this area. And this is a great place to, you know, it can be extremely painful if you have a lot of stored grief to touch on it. And, you know, the sensations can be really intense as it's leaving the body. And so tell me a little bit about what exactly is swishing, because it's like maybe if you're in this trauma response and you've had these repeated mental thoughts constantly, you just need to sort of like calm down the trauma response. And it sounds like swishing does that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So
like one memory at a time, right?
Yeah, exactly. So another presupposition of NLP is basically that your thoughts and your emotions and your responses kind of form in a circle. So, you get a neutral stimuli, you feel a certain way about it, and then you remember and respond to that feeling, not to that stimuli. So, if there was like this barking dog and a white fence every time you drove home into your driveway and, like your childhood home, and that was just this association of like dread, fear, guilt, all these different things that you associated your childhood with, then, anytime you see a white fence and a dog, that might just kind of trigger you or pull you back or make you kind of dissociate for a second. It'll have some sort of effect on you. So what swishing can help you do is it can help you look at the dog and the fence as a neutral stimuli, and you can start to reassociate it with something else. So now every time you think of a dog and a fence, you think of, I don't know, a certain vacation that you went on, or you think of ice cream. Like, it could be totally random if you want it to be, and you basically start to reassociate that with something that's a more neutral stimuli. And so that, yeah, it's a great way to, especially if there's a trigger that you can't avoid or something that just, comes up for you suddenly, you can start to go through the chain of events in your mind and say, no, this equals this. I'm like, you can purposely, and that's the thing, the main idea of all of this is really to take what's happening subconsciously and become conscious about it. So when you can consciously talk to yourself and say, no, this does not equal danger, this equals ice cream, then you are kind of neutralizing that initial fear and that response, and you're taking that jump out of the equation and you're just putting something else there. So that's kind of the premise of how swishing works, and it's a little bit easier on like an individual by individual basis. But yeah, it's about just kind of training your mind to think about one specific thing differently.
And I really like that, because I think, again, if you have PTSD or complex PTSD, you have a tendency to be triggered all over the place, like in a constant state of stress. Me and you could be sitting here together and I'm feeling that stress in my body, despite physically in the here and now, no apparent trigger or negative stimuli is there, but I'm going back to that thought all the time obsessively, and I'm living in that traumatized space. And so this could be a good way to like basically just interrupt that, operating system, that virus in your operating system, and reset it. So you put the memory away and store it in a more neutral space, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of it, like I was saying, it's just about being conscious about it. So once you get to that point where you realize that that is your trigger, because a lot of times we think so quickly that we don't realize that that's our trigger. We just kind of hear a certain word, and then all of a sudden we're like starting to have a panic attack, and it's like, it's scary. So when you slowly, the first step is really just slowing down your thoughts and saying, okay, I heard someone say something about not being perfect. All of a sudden I had a panic attack. It's because, I'm afraid that I'm not perfect. I'm afraid that I'm not good enough. And all these fears start to come out of it, but it happened in a split second. So when you realize that you slow down your thoughts enough to know what your trigger is, then it's all about, whenever that trigger comes up, just saying no, just saying, I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. And being able to create that space is really, really helpful. Yeah. And that's something that I kind of lost my thought, but it's just about, I remember, it's about not spiraling. And for a long time, I would just go from 0 to panic attack, but then I kind of opened up that space, and then I could say, I know what it sounds like in my mind when my self-talk is like spiraling out of control. And then normally I'll like if it's about like finances or something random, then all of a sudden I'm like looking for a new job or on the, and it's like, just turn that off, just stop that, and don't allow yourself to go down that rabbit hole. And when you've gotten to that point where you've created enough space between your reaction and your thought, a lot of healing and a lot of change in your personality can come from that.
I like that where you talk about space between your reaction and your thought. Like, that's super important. And like, because to me, I think that a lot of people stay numb and they don't want to examine they're in denial about a lot of their trauma response because they don't want to dig into it. They're afraid of spiraling. They're afraid, once I open this up, I don't know how I'm going to handle it. And it's not that's not a conscious thought, really. So tell us a little bit about anchoring, because I think that was really helpful to hear, because especially in some of the mentoring that I've done with a shamanic practitioner, when you're in like a shamanic journey and you go somewhere and it's like really intense, we're taught like ways to stay grounded to like Mother Earth, basically. Stay grounded in the present moment, like to allow us, it's sort of like an umbilical cord that keeps you safe while you go and examine this deep, dark, painful, area of your soul. And tell me, anchoring is very similar to that. It's like a way for your brain to just come back to the here and now in a safe space so that you can go explore. And then, when you're like, training time out, I got to stop, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the premise of anchoring kind of works in the same way that a trigger works. So a trigger is like the negative version of it, but you see something and it immediately takes you to another place. So because we know that that's kind of how the brain works, NLP has taken that and said, how about we reframe this into something positive, so that if we can, and there's all kinds of anchors, there's spatial anchors, kinesthetic anchors. So I'll talk about a kinesthetic anchor because it's the most simple one, but you can basically store a certain feeling and a certain emotion and certain memories in either a physical space, on your body, etc. So it's actually really cool. And what you do, so mine is as simple as just this. This is my kinesthetic anchor. I touch my thumb to the inside knuckle of my middle finger, and that's all that is to it. So so even if you want, if this is kind of your comfortable habit, like crossing your arms, you could say that this touch to your elbow is your kinesthetic anchor. Anything that's kind of discreet, simple that you could do. It could even be crossing your fingers if you like that. It doesn't really matter. But what you do is
sticking your tongue to the back of your teeth can kind of close the energetic circle. Yes.
That's a good one, actually.
Yeah.
So the premise is basically to just visualize, moments that you were really happy, or that, you felt really satisfied. And you can create an anchor for anything. If you want one kinesthetic anchor for confidence and another one for relaxation and to help you go to sleep or something, that's completely fine. All you do is you pick, the mood or the energy that you want to store. And then you start thinking about times that made you feel that way. And if you really can't think of a specific memory in your own life or something, then you can think of a movie that you watched, or, just something that makes you really happy that you loved. Even if it's like a certain food, you could think about that food. And when you're really living that moment or reliving that memory, that's a positive one. When you feel like you're kind of at the peak of happiness, so, you're living it as if you were back in that moment. And if you're thinking about a favorite food or something, think about eating that food. And like when it's the most satisfying, like when, after it's been about 15 to 20 seconds, you'll probably get to that point. And that's when you just touch that anchor point.
It's essentially helping you to, instead of arrive at, be triggered and arrive at a negative memory or association, it's helping you reassociate and arrive at a positive one to sort of counteract and interrupt this other negative response.
Exactly.
Creating a neural pathway for positive feelings and thoughts instead of, Well, that's really awesome. Roshni, I'm really, really happy that you spoke with us about all of this today. I know our listeners probably want to hear more from you. How can they find you outside of this interview series?
Yeah, so my brand is Betty Grew Up. So my Instagram is BETI Grew Up, and that is where I am on YouTube as well. And then my website is the same thing, www.bettygrew-up.com. And that is where they can find me. I post a daily affirmation with weekly themes on Instagram every day. So, and then I also have videos once or twice a week about like NLP and mental health and just kind of taking back control of these things. And then I'm also actually hosting a workshop on anchoring, so stacking anchors and chaining anchors and just getting a little bit more detailed with it. So I'll probably have that at the end of June or the beginning of July. So if you follow me on Instagram, I will definitely keep you updated on when that workshop will be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. And we're going to close for now. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. Bye for now.
Thanks, Christina.
You're welcome.